Let's see. Dr. Timothy Lippman, would you come up? So Dr. Lippman is co-director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at UC Berkeley. And he is a energy and environmental technology economics policy researcher. He's serving as co-director of the campus's Transportation Technology Research Center, based at, and he's a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His research focuses on electric vehicles, fuel cell technologies, combined heat and power systems, renewable energy, and electricity and hydrogen infrastructure. He has a PhD in environmental policy analysis with the Graduate Group of Ecology at UC Davis. Also holds an MS degree from Davis in Transportation Technology Policy and a BA from Stanford. He's a bright guy. He's chair of the Alternative Transportation Fuels and Technology Committee, the National Academy of Sciences, and a lot of other things that there's not time to talk about if we're going to hear from him. So, again, thank you very much, Dr. Lippman, for being here. You're going to talk about hydrogen fuel vehicles, and in my case, I'm particularly concerned about, I think it's a wonderful technology. I think it could be the ultimate answer in many ways because you can fuel quickly. It has great range, and you can take the hydrogen if you could do electrolysis cheaply enough. You could take the hydrogen. Basically, it's an infinite it's an infinite battery. You can then take and retrofit your old power plants and run them on hydrogen. It's a dream, but I know it's also a dream that's very hard to accomplish.
True.
So if you could talk about where we are in getting there.
Yes.
And
be happy to.
And what we as a state might do to make a difference.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's nice to see you again, Assemblyman Quirk. I could tell we did a briefing with the Union of Concerned Scientists about a year ago that some staffers and yourself attended. And I could tell by the questions that you asked that you're a very shrewd, sharp study on this stuff. So I'll maybe not be able to answer all your questions because you're that sharp, but I'll certainly be able to get you answers if I don't have an answer off the top of my head for some of the questions. I don't know exactly where you're going to go because, as you know, this is a pretty nuanced and kind of complicated topic. And I apologize for the voice. I'm getting over a little bug. And then last night, I live in Oakland, and you can imagine there was a little bit of revelry going on. So it wasn't the most restful night. But with that, clearly these technologies have advanced greatly in recent years. UC Berkeley has been doing this research for about 10 years now. And we've been sort of slowly testing a hypothesis that consumers may be attracted to these vehicles because of their green attributes, but also because they're better cars in terms of their overall drivability. We see this with electric vehicles. People, I don't know how many of you have driven like a Tesla, the shining example, but the electric cars tend to offer great driver advantages, so that gives us a lot of hope. And they have significant emission reduction potential near term, depending on how the hydrogen is produced, with potential for major reductions in the future, as you mentioned, if we could get to some sort of clean electrolysis with low-cost electricity. We could actually get to zero carbon, which is where we need to go. I think we all agree we need to go, in the longer term. Even the G7 summit, they were just talking about the need to break away from fossil fuels in a big way. And so this offers a pathway where we use natural gas initially as kind of a bridge to that ultimate low carbon future. So we'll talk a little bit about what the state can do in a minute. I just want to give you a quick, I'll go through these pretty quickly because I know you want to ask some questions. Our program started in 2005 with a Daimler A-Class vehicle, which is actually a predecessor to the B-Class vehicle that I drove up in here today. I'll show you a picture of in a minute. In 2008, we got 3 additional vehicles, and these vehicles were all operating at 5,000 psi hydrogen, which is a little more pressure than a scuba tank, for example. And they offer driving ranges of around 100 to 160 miles, which consumers found, interesting, but they were similar to the ranges that battery electric vehicles were offering at that time. What happened around 2008 was a move in the industry to go to higher pressure storage, 700 bar or 10,000 psi. And we built a small station in Richmond at our UC Berkeley facility with Toyota and the Air District. Actually became the first high pressure hydrogen station to become operational in Northern California. And we've learned a lot from operating that station over the last 4 years. I will say the infrastructure is really the key issue at this point. The vehicles, I'll show you in a minute, the consumers really like. The performance is great. We're now testing 8 different vehicles from 3 different manufacturers with ranges of 240 to 300 miles, and as you mentioned, the quick refueling capability of about 5 minutes, 4 minutes. These are the vehicles we're currently testing. The one in the foreground here is the newest one. It's a Hyundai Tucson fuel cell vehicle that's now being leased in Los Angeles for $500 a month, which includes fuel and maintenance. The next vehicle, this is where I was this morning. It's not that exact picture, but it was that vehicle that I drove up here today, and this is the B-Class Mercedes vehicle that's about 240 miles range. Actually, a several-year-old technology at this point, but still driving great. And then here's our Richmond station and the newest station in West Sacramento, which just became available a few weeks ago. And now you can go into the West Sacramento station, swipe a credit card, fill up in 4 minutes just like a gas station, and off you go with 250 to 300 miles range. This is kind of an older slide from Ballard, which is a Canadian company up in Vancouver, but it shows the kind of progress through the 1990s of this fuel cell technology. And I was a graduate student, as you mentioned, at UC Davis in the mid-1990s when the fuel cells looked kind of like this, and this is 50 kilowatts of fuel cell, which isn't really even enough to drive a car. And these, you don't really have a sense of scale here, but that was a lot of material and way too much stuff to try to put inside a vehicle. But through a tremendous amount of engineering through the 1990s, by the late 1990s, we were getting 50 kilowatt stacks, which is about enough to drive a car. That's about 60 or 70 horsepower. And then fully packaged systems by the early 2000s that could offer 100 horsepower. And by the way, 100 horsepower electric is something like 150 horsepower gasoline in terms of how it feels when you're driving, because you get much better torque from electric motors, and they're not quite comparable. So this is plenty of power to drive a vehicle by the early 2000s. This is, again, an older slide, but it shows some of the evolution from that early A-class vehicle that was about 100 miles range to this newer B-class vehicle. The size of the stack decreased by 40%. For that, even with that decrease, the power increased 30%, efficiency increased by 30%, and range increased by 150%. So this is where people like me who had been studying the technology for a long time started to get pretty excited, because we could now see how these vehicles could really fit into people's lives, even with a fairly sparse refueling network, because it's one thing to have low range like you do in electric vehicles, but if you can plug in everywhere, that's not necessarily a big problem. But if you have low range and not very many hydrogen stations, that's a problem. So this is where the industry, I think, started to see a clear path to commercialization for these vehicles, but with the issues on the infrastructure side. And then this is now the commercial reality of the leased Hyundai vehicle being filled in Emeryville. Again, there are several hundred of these vehicles in Los Angeles now being leased for $500 a month, which includes fuel and maintenance. So this is a slide from the Department of Energy that shows how from 2008, the cost of the fuel cells from 2006 to 2008, the cost of fuel cells dropped. This is recent. From 2006, the costs have fallen 50%. From 2008, the costs have now fallen 30% from those levels, to the point where the current high volume cost estimates, and I stress high volume because we're not in high volume manufacturing yet, the high volume cost estimates are now about $55 per kilowatt with a goal of $40 per kilowatt by 2020. That $40 a kilowatt is about what a diesel engine costs. So the goal of the industry really is to bring the cost of these vehicles down close to what a diesel vehicle might sell for. And they now see a clear path to that. There is an important point, though, that for the fuel cell stack itself, you can see they've reduced the platinum catalyst greatly, but for the fuel cell stack, about half the cost of the fuel cell stack is platinum catalyst material, which is needed for the low temperatures that these fuel cells operate. There are higher temperature fuel cells. You might have heard of the Bloom box or molten carbonate fuel cells that operate at much higher temperatures for stationary power. Those do not need platinum catalysts, but they have other issues of their own. But for these lower temperature fuel cells in the cars that really operate only at about 80 degrees Celsius, so fairly cool, this platinum catalyst is needed, and it's expensive stuff, and the industry is still striving to reduce the amount of that and possibly even to find substitutes that are cheaper materials. So that's a challenge that remains. A couple quick slides on our test program. So what we do with our cars, we don't just run them around and collect data for the automakers, although we do that too. We put drivers in the cars for 2 to 4 weeks at a time, and we say they're real people, not just Berkeley professor types. And we have them fill out before and after surveys to see what their attitudes and opinions were going into the test drive and then how that changes through a 2 to 4 week experience with the vehicle. We train the drivers to fill themselves because we're really interested in how they perceive the refueling. Hydrogen has a lot of funny connotations to people. They think about the Hindenburg, they think about hydrogen bombs, they think about all sorts of crazy stuff that has nothing to do with hydrogen as a vehicle fuel. I'll also quickly point out that we sort of talk about hydrogen as if it's this new thing, but industry in the United States uses huge amounts of hydrogen. About 10 million tons of hydrogen are produced and used each year in industry around the United States for mostly petrochemical uses, fertilizers, metallurgy, that kind of thing. So it's not a new thing. It's just new to be dispensed as a retail vehicle fuel. By the end of June, we'll have 50 drivers through our Toyota study, which is a month-long test drive study, and then we're also putting drivers in the Hyundai cars now. And what we find is that this says, overall, how has the FCHV met your expectations? And for most of the people, it either greatly exceeds or exceeds their expectations. Some people say it met their expectations, and no one, this is when we had 36 drivers through, these are slightly older numbers, no one was disappointed in these vehicles.
If you could go through those next ones,
Yep.
We'll just give you that it's a great drive, and maybe we can get into some of the other
Yep.
concerns.
Let me just do this one real quick, because this is the safety one, which I thought was really interesting, where after even less than a month or a month of driving, some of the drivers felt it was much safer or safer. Most of the drivers said it was about as safe as gasoline after only a month of fueling, which surprised us a little bit because it is a new experience. It's a different fuel. I want to touch on the hydrogen buses because this is something I really think we could do a lot more with. The hydrogen bus technology is also greatly improved in terms of packaging, getting the systems down to fit in the buses better. AC Transit, as many of you know, has a fleet of 12 buses now that have been operating for a number of years. They had their first bus in 2005. One of the buses has operated for more than 16,000 hours, which has exceeded the durability that many people thought these fuel cells could produce before they would need to be replaced. Over 1 million miles of service and 3 million passengers carried. And the Emeryville station has now dispensed over 100,000 kilograms of hydrogen fuel, mostly for the buses, but also the light-duty vehicles can come in and fuel on the other side of the fence now. And they now have an Oakland station as well, and they plan to expand this fleet to at least another dozen buses when they can get the funding. And we also did a survey of the fuel cell bus drivers, and these people are in contact with the technology for hours every day. Some people had surveyed the bus passengers before, but very few people had surveyed the bus drivers, and these are the people who really have a feel for the technology. So we got about 50 bus drivers to respond to a survey, and they really liked particularly the quiet operation. You can imagine compared to a diesel bus, if you're in these things all day long, they rated that very high. They liked the ride quality, thought the handling was very good. Acceleration was excellent compared to the diesel buses. Again, you get very high torque out of these electric motors, so they're fun to drive and good for urban bus settings where there's a lot of stop-and-go driving and they need to duck in and out of traffic a lot. The braking, there were some issues, and one of the bus routes is on a very hilly route, and that's where most of these concerns were. So there were some concerns with the braking, and these vehicles have regenerative braking. Maybe that's something the industry can work on a little bit more. But overall, kind of similar to the vehicles, many of the drivers liked the buses much better. Some said the same. Minority didn't like them as well. So I want to switch a little bit to the emissions question with just a couple slides. This is a national view. So this uses a model called the GREET model out of Argonne National Laboratories. It was initially developed by a colleague of Tom Turrentine, Dr. Turrentine, and myself at UC Davis, and he's gone on to develop this model over the last 20 years at Argonne. And it shows something kind of important. So kind of forget the plant cycle for now. That's just the manufacturing plant. But some people will say, well, these vehicles are great, but it takes so much energy to make the batteries and the fuel cells that they're going to have higher carbon emissions than a conventional vehicle because of all those manufacturing emissions. I even saw a study that said it was better to drive a Hummer than a Prius because of the batteries in the Prius, which is completely wrong-headed. And this kind of shows that. The vehicle cycle are these yellow bars. And you can see that it's true that the yellow bars for the electric vehicles are a little bit higher. So each electric vehicle, when it's new, does start with a little bit of a carbon debt compared to a conventional vehicle. It has more embodied energy and emissions. But then in use, which is the orange and blue, well to pump and pump to wheels, you can see that on a grams per mile basis, fuel cell vehicles and battery electric vehicles running on natural gas, again, you really have to ask where the hydrogen and electricity are coming from, offer much lower in-use emissions, even though they have slightly higher manufacturing emissions. So that's just one kind of myth I like to dispel. However, if you got to the Midwest where we burn a lot of coal for electricity, the battery electric vehicles don't look as good, but the fuel cell vehicles running on hydrogen produced 100% from natural gas, again, as sort of a transitional step, do much better than coal-fired electric vehicles, but not quite as good as natural gas battery electrics. So here's a slide for California, more relevant for us, that shows if you're using what we call the California mix for hydrogen, and that's 67% natural gas, 33% renewables. And you need to do that in order to qualify for the state money to build the hydrogen stations. In order to get that money, if you're not 100% renewable, you have to be 67% natural gas, 33% renewable. And then here's electricity from the California mix. So you can see here in California, the battery electrics or plug-in hybrids, where there's a lot of electric miles, are actually the cleanest option. And for people who can make those vehicles work for their lives, that's a great choice. For other people, though, and this might include people who live in multi-unit dwellings who don't have easy access to charging, it's the case that almost 50% of Californians live in, or do not, do not live in single-family homes. In San Francisco, it's 70% of people do not live in single-family homes. Now, maybe some of those people can charge at work and can still make a plug-in work. But for a lot of people for whom plugging in is difficult, hydrogen from the California mix stations offers nearly the same, very close to the same emission reductions or close to it.
I have a question about that.
Yep, go ahead.
The comparison, the middle one is essentially comparison with the biodiesel mix.
E85 is 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. And that typically would be a corn-based ethanol in this market. Of course, as I think we'll hear later, and maybe as brought up in the last talk, we're trying to get to cellulosic ethanol, lower carbon types of biofuels. But this would be conventional ethanol, typically corn ethanol, 85% with 15% gasoline. So you can see that doesn't offer very much of an emission reduction because of how we produce corn. It's particularly bad in the Midwest, but even here in California, it takes a lot of fertilizers and energy to produce the corn, to produce the biofuel. So you don't really get much of an emission reduction from E85.
And that looks a lot different if you look at different feedstocks that are higher cellulose.
Absolutely.
Cellulosic.
Absolutely. I have a slide for backup at the end if there's more questions. It's kind of a busy slide, so I didn't want to show it, but it shows some of those cellulosic pathways. And absolutely, you can get very low emissions with cellulosic pathways going from, I think, corn stover was mentioned. I've done some research at UC Berkeley with the Energy Biosciences Institute. We were looking at miscanthus grass, which is a fast-growing grass-type crop that doesn't need...
We'll get into that.
Okay, yeah, we'll get into that later. So this is kind of a key slide I wanted to spend just a minute on. So again, on emissions, this is a Natural Resource Council study from 2013 looking at scenarios now, not just sort of single pathways of fuels and vehicles, but scenarios for how we can get to 80% reduction from 2005 levels. So where we really think we need to get by 2050. This is kind of a 2050 type view. And so you see this is conventional kind of business as usual scenario. And then the blue bars represent kind of a reference current production technology. The red bars assume some future progress in production technologies in terms of efficiencies and so forth. There's a lot of assumptions here that are too much to go into. But they're basically then these key scenarios. So here's an efficiency scenario, basically think about a lot of hybrid vehicles and more efficient combustion strategies. And in this case, a carbon price and a fee-bait scheme to drive people into those vehicles. So there's sort of a lot of things going on. But it actually looks like, that efficiency scenario could get pretty far, especially with, a lot of assumptions and progress. The next one includes biofuels with some carbon capture and sequestration, that's CCS. So if you believe you can do carbon capture and sequestration, and I'm a little skeptical of that personally, then maybe an efficiency plus biofuel strategy could get you very close to this level. The next one is a heavy plug-in electric vehicle scenario. Where you have lower greenhouse gas grid, but again, giving the baseline that we're working off of now with heavy coal in the Midwest and about 50% coal nationwide, that doesn't really get you there if it's just pure plug-in vehicles, assuming progress from our current grid. Of course, there are ways to get there on an individual level if you want to put solar panels on your roof and that kind of thing. The fuel cell vehicle, a heavy fuel cell vehicle scenario with lower greenhouse gas hydrogen production, so thinking about biofuel feedstocks for hydrogen, clean electricity, and so forth, can get you there, it appears, from this scenario. And if you just burn natural gas, that's not a good solution. That doesn't do it. But then this last scenario, where you have plug-in electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and biofuels, can get you significantly below the target and perhaps requires less aggressive market uptake to achieve those levels. So the kind of punchline here is I want you to not think about, is it fuel cell or plug-in electric or biofuels? We need them all, because not any one of these things can really probably do it on its own. It's not all of the above energy policy of the Obama administration, because that includes the fossil fuels that we want to get rid of. But I do think there's a very strong argument for a scenario that includes plug-in electric vehicles for those who can make those work for them, fuel cell vehicles for those who have longer driving distances and maybe don't have access to charging, and then biofuels where we still use liquid fuels for other applications. So I don't know, I think I'm running out of time here. Let me just conclude quickly. The support for the hydrogen infrastructure that's going on right now from the legislature, I think, is excellent. It's very well timed. The eyes of the world are really on it, I can tell you, from traveling outside of California. The support for light-duty vehicles through the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program is likely to be helpful, particularly as we get more fuel cell vehicles on the marketplace and more consumers out there trying to adopt them. The federal government incentive of $7,500 has just expired at a kind of awkward time for fuel cell vehicles, but that's not really a concern for California. I think we're doing what we can. By comparison, though, the Japanese government is offering a $20,000 incentive to bring the cost of the next generation fuel cell vehicle by Toyota, is what they're really focusing on, from $60,000 down to $40,000. So I would think what we really want now are some complementary programs to look at some other market segments, fuel cell-powered trucks, not necessarily long haul, but drayage vehicles for ports. Ports are very dirty, and they have a lot of needs for electrification that I think we could look at. The buses are doing an amazing job in the Bay Area, and I think support for additional bus programs could be very helpful. And then delivery vehicles, garbage trucks that wake everyone up at 6 in the morning. I think people would love it if they were a lot quieter. So vehicles like that. I think the medium and heavy-duty vehicles that are not as amenable to full electrification, but they could be battery dominant with fuel cell range extenders are what are needed. And then I would also suggest looking at high mileage vehicles, things like taxis that are driven a lot. And we could talk a little bit about that because there's some sort of fuel cost issues there, but where you can really get a lot of emission reductions for a single vehicle. And then what we need is a lot of sort of market readiness stuff. We can't just drop these vehicles and technologies into the world and expect them to succeed. We need to train safety officials, firemen, tow truck drivers, mechanics, and so forth. So I think
very
I'll
good.
conclude there.
So first, I want to introduce one more Assembly member who has just arrived, Assemblymember Brian Dolly, a true environmentalist. He is a seed farmer. He attends our environmental caucus meetings on a regular basis and is the resident go-to person for looking at our forests and how to keep them from burning up and how to use the resources for energy. And he has really made a place for himself in those areas. He is the go-to person in those areas. Assemblymember Dolly, is there something you would like to add here? Just a few opening statements.
Yes, thank you for that gracious introduction. But I'm here to learn. Thank you. And there's, the cellulose. We've been trying to get a way to make products out of, woody biomass for a long time. And I'm excited about the new technologies that are there. And I represent a district of 25,000 square miles. So we all represent the same amount of people, but I have a lot long distances to drive, and so the plug-in models don't work where we're at. So we're looking for that alternative type of fuel that will get us the longer distances.
Yeah, let me just make one quick comment on that. Is the Blue Lake Rancheria in your district by chance? No, okay. Well, there's a project, fuel cell power project at the Blue Lake Rancheria that's going in right now. That's a wood waste to hydrogen project that's being spearheaded by the Redwood Coast Energy Authority and our colleagues up at Humboldt State University. So they're putting in the same type of fuel cell technology that's in the cars, what's called the proton exchange membrane fuel cell technology that'll be powered with hydrogen from wood waste gasification. So that same kind of pathway could make hydrogen for vehicles. There are some cleanup steps needed, but given all that fuel out there, that we'd rather convert to something we can use productively than see it go up into the atmosphere in a forest fire. I think that's a very interesting idea.
All right. I knew he would. So this $500 a month for fuel and the vehicle, hey, I'll take that now. But I suspect that that's not available on the market. What are the true costs right now of a fuel cell vehicle, say comparable vehicle looking at gas, electric, and then fuel cell? And let's assume that you do get high volumes so that you can bring the cost of that engine down. How do you compare those three options?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's going to evolve. I think, as the previous speaker said, this is kind of it's kind of a competition where costs are falling, but it's going to be interesting to see how the fuel cell system costs fall compared to batteries. There are some studies that suggest that the fuel cell cars could be cheaper by 2030 than either full battery electrics or conventional vehicles, with all the emission controls and additional efficiency that's going to be needed to bring those cars up to CAFE standard levels, which are rising quickly. So just for reference, Toyota has announced that the sales price, Toyota will be the first one to sell a car where you can just buy it. And that price will be $57,500. Now, there's considerable questions in my mind whether that's even includes the full manufacturing cost, let alone profit. We know when they released the Prius, they forward priced it somewhat so that they weren't covering their full cost, but they knew that if they could start selling them, the cost would fall, and that would then include profit. So I think Toyota's following the same model. So $57,500. There's a $5,000 state incentive that brings that down to about $52,500. If we could get the $7,500 back from the federal government, that would be $45,000, and then $1,500 from the air district gets you down to $43,500, something like that. So that's what a Toyota will cost in the fall for consumers. So for the cost of one Tesla Model S, you could put 2 of the new Toyota Mirai fuel cell cars in your garage, but it's still somewhat expensive. But the industry does seem to think, and based on those cost targets I showed you, that once they get into high volume, and that's a couple 100,000 units per year, and that will take several years to achieve, that the cost could be very comparable again to a diesel vehicle, maybe in the mid $30,000 range for fuel cell. And battery electric, I would say similar. I think Dr. Turntine will probably comment a little bit on that. But I see them all, the fuel cells will be a little more expensive for a while, but then I see them all coming down to a very close range at some point. And Mercedes has said that in the future, and not distant future, you'll be able to buy any Mercedes vehicle with your choice of either of the 3 drivetrains, gasoline or diesel, full battery electric, or maybe plug-in hybrid, I'm not sure, or fuel cell drivetrain. So you'll be able to pick your car and then pick the drivetrain, and they expect the cost to be somewhat, not too different.
Great. What about using carbon capture and sequestration when you're making hydrogen from natural gas? One would think that would be easier than, say, in a fossil fuel plant, because you've got it right there. The two products are hydrogen and CO2. Does that look feasible?
I think it's feasible. I think with any carbon capture and sequestration, the thing is, where are you sequestering it, and what is the integrity of that reservoir? How confident are we that it's going to stay where you're putting it? And the deep ocean stuff, that's difficult because you can't do that everywhere. There are other places where you might have geologic reservoirs where you can, salt domes and things like that. But so it's feasible, but it is actually easier to strip CO2 out of a coal stream because the CO2 concentration is a lot higher. But it's feasible. It's costly. And I think the ultimate integrity,
even when you're dealing with hydrogen from natural gas, is still very costly.
Yeah.
What about how soon are we likely to see fuel from essentially from electrolysis of water that's at a reasonable price per mile compared to, let's say, $5 a gallon gasoline?
That's a really good question. So what that depends on are sort of 2 different things. One is the electrolyzer technology itself. An electrolyzer is very similar to a fuel cell. It's basically a fuel cell run backwards. It's very similar technology, but it uses a lot of the same types of materials. So the electrolyzer costs are quite high, but they also lend themselves to the same very steep volume manufacturing reductions that we see for fuel cell vehicles. So I think electrolyzers in volume could come down to the point where the capital cost piece isn't such a big factor. The real factor is that it takes about 50 or 60 kilowatt hours of electricity to make a kilogram of hydrogen. So if you want, let's say your $5 a gallon example, with the efficiency of fuel cell vehicles, we could have hydrogen at about $10 a kilogram. A kilogram of hydrogen has the same energy as a gallon of gasoline, very close. So if you go twice as far on a kilogram of hydrogen as a gallon of gasoline, which is the case roughly, if gasoline's at 5, hydrogen can be at 10, but you still have to figure out how to then electrolyze 50 kilowatt hours of hydrogen and end up with $10 a kilogram hydrogen, and you need a fairly cheap electricity source to do that. But I do see that being possible maybe in the next 10 to 15 years.
So it's not something that's likely to be economically feasible to be a major part of our goals for 2030, but we could hope for beyond that.
Yes. And there are places, I think there are settings where if you can, instead of using room temperature water, if you had a high heat source, and nuclear isn't one of my favorite technologies, but where you have nuclear plants, you have a lot of waste heat that they need to
This
get
is
rid of.
California. Let's not worry about nuclear, unfortunately.
Right. But so there may be other places, though, where there are high, like maybe the geysers or something, where you have high heat sources, maybe even some fossil fuel plants, and you can electrolyze water that's close to steam temperature. It takes a lot less electricity. So ideas like that, I think, over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
All right.
But for now, natural gas is mixed with some level of renewable through electrolysis or biogas is the immediate pathway.
So are there things we can do in the state to help us along the way towards true economic efficiency? I mean, we're looking now at electrical vehicles after a number of years. Are the things we really need to do to get us along the line to hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, the state's doing a lot. And I mean, I really think you guys are to be commended for what you're doing. I mean, it's really leading the world, I will say, and it's not just cheerleading. I mean, the world is watching the stations that we're building here. We're making progress. There's some progress in Germany, but really I think we're doing a great job with that. What I think we need to focus on, and consumers and fleets are very focused on fuel cost. The vehicle cost is very important, but somehow, even though the cost of the fuel to consumers isn't really that big a part of the overall cost of owning a car by the time you factor in insurance and parking tolls and parking tickets and all that stuff, they really focus on fuel costs. And when gas goes down to $3.50 a gallon, they all run out and buy SUVs. And then when the gas goes back up, they complain about the high fuel cost. So with hydrogen, the fuel cost is somewhat higher right now. It's actually different than electricity, where if you get the right utility rate, electricity is quite a bit cheaper than gasoline. And so there's kind of an argument there. Oh, I buy an electric car, I get to save money on fuel. With hydrogen, near term, we're at about $12 or $13 a kilogram, a little higher than the $10 we were just referencing. And of course, gas is around $3.50, $4. So we're a little bit higher on the fuel cost. Now, we expect gasoline to go up and hydrogen to go down to the point where they are comparable. But near term, some sort of way, certainly making sure that we're not taxing hydrogen at the pump, if you will. It's appropriate for hydrogen fuel cell vehicle and electric vehicle drivers to pay some road user fees because they use the roads too. But I'd like to see that be more of an annual fee, perhaps, than to have them pay it at the pump, because that just kind of hides it, if you will.
It's psychology.
It's a little bit of subterfuge, but it's psychology. So leaving hydrogen untaxed, would help until the cost comes down. Perhaps some kind of fleet hydrogen credit or voucher program where if fleets adopt hydrogen as a fuel, they get some kind of break on the fuel cost, so they can see their way through to a break even with gasoline. Just as we do subsidize, vehicles some for private consumers, maybe the fuel could be subsidized some for fleet type applications to make the fleet managers wrap around. So I think those are the kinds of ideas that could help with the market pull piece, get more of the vehicles out there, help with these cost and volume reductions that we've been talking about.
Well, that's fantastic. Other questions? Assembly Member Irwin.
I actually had one of the same questions as Mr. Quirk about the cost of the vehicle. Mm-hmm. And I did probably about 8 years ago, I was able to go for a test ride in a hydrogen vehicle. And at that time, the cost for the vehicle was $1 million, and it was $1 million a year to maintain. And they told me that in 10 years, these would come down to the cost of a regular vehicle. So it's really quite amazing that it followed that line. Yep. My question's we're talking about developing the infrastructure, and there are, I don't know, how many of these fueling stations are there, and yep. What percent of the infrastructure has been developed? I didn't really hear you talk about a timeline for that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let me run through that. I wasn't sure how well kind of briefed you guys were on that. So right now, there really are only about roughly 10 hydrogen stations in California. And at any given time, a few of them will be down for maintenance. They require a fair amount of maintenance, I know, for maintaining our station in Richmond for the last 4 years. But there are about 20 stations under construction right now, or in various stages of construction, permitting, and so forth. And then there are about another 20 that are slated to be funded. So I think there are maybe 10 or so. So the goal is to get to about 70 by 2018. And to 100 stations by around 2020, I think, are the numbers. Actually, I think maybe we cut it off. I had a backup slide that actually showed that. Maybe it's in your, I see it there in your materials there. There's kind of a little bit of a vehicle and station timeline that shows you the California Fuel Cell Partnership's projections for how the rollout of stations needs to kind of match the rollout of the vehicles, so that basically, on average, a fuel cell vehicle will use about 1 kilogram of hydrogen a day. So we need to have enough dispensing capacity so that each vehicle can fill up, every few days with 3 or 4 kilograms. And that number of stations that's shown there could meet that need, where I think it's 100 stations by 2020, does it say, or something like that. So that, I think, does that answer your question? Yeah. And it seems to got cut off, sorry for the audience, but it'll be in the other materials.
Thank you.
Well, you have done a great job. I have a much better idea after this of where we are in the technology. And my conclusion would be that our role in rolling out to 2030 would be to find ways to encourage the market to grow in volume so these technologies could come down in cost, but probably not a large contribution to the reduction in greenhouse gases. Nonetheless, that's a lot more than I knew before, so I really appreciate your being up here. And if you have specific things you think we ought to do the market pull part of this, and you've mentioned number now, we should have more conversations and look at what we can do down the road.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, and I look forward to any kind of follow-up you'd like. And there really are some low-carbon pathways that can play out in the next 10, 20 years as well that we can talk more about.
Great.
Thank you.
Let's
Thank
do
you.
it.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So our next person is Dr. Tom Turrentine. He's the director of the Plug-in Hybrid Electric and Vehicle Research Center at the Institution of Transportation Studies from UC Davis. For the past 20 years, he's been researching consumer response to alternative vehicles, vehicle technologies. His recent work includes multi-year projects to study consumer markets and use of plug-in vehicles. And his research is studying EV, electric vehicle, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle market development, driver use patterns, planning tools, way to integrate plug-in vehicles into the electrical grid, optimal design of energy use and feedback displays. Is there anything you